She thought she was marrying a millionaire on his deathbed, but she didn't realize she was actually signing a contract for $1.5 million in debt. By the time she realized the marriage certificate was a legal cage, I had already frozen her bank accounts and called the FBI. She tried to steal my friend's life. I decided to audit her into a prison cell. My name is Agatha Aggie Sterling. In the world of federal investigations, I was known as a ghost hunter. I spent 35 years as a forensic accountant for the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. My job wasn't to look at what people said, it was to look at what they spent. I've dismantled cartels by following a single misplaced decimal point and taken down corrupt politicians by auditing their dry cleaning receipts. When you spend your life staring at the truth found in ledgers, you realize that people lie, but numbers never do. I retired to a quiet life of reading and gardening, thinking my days of hunting predators were over. I was wrong. The target was my oldest and dearest friend, Silas Vance. Silas is a man of immense dignity, a retired architect who spent 50 years designing the skylines of this country. He built a $5 million estate through hard work and discipline. But 6 months ago, the structure of his life collapsed. He suffered a massive ischemic stroke in his study. He was found hours later and rushed to the ICU. When I arrived at the hospital, I expected to see medical teams and family. Instead, I found a barricade. A woman was sitting by his bed, holding his hand with a grip that looked more like a trap than a comfort. Her name was Lydia Cross. She was 40 years younger than Silas, dressed in expensive scrubs and radiating a fake practiced warmth. Before I could even say his name, she stood up and blocked my path. She didn't look like a nurse. She looked like a gargoyle guarding a prize. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness that made my skin crawl. "Only immediate family is allowed in during the recovery phase. Silas needs peace, and the doctors have been very clear about limiting his stress." "I am his medical proxy and his closest friend for 40 years, I replied, my ghost hunter instinct screaming that something was wrong. "I have the legal right to be in this room. Who exactly are you, and why are you touching his hand?" She smiled then, a cold, triumphant flash of teeth that sent a shiver down my spine. She reached into her designer bag and pulled out a notarized document. "I'm Lydia Vance. We were married yesterday, right here in the ICU. Silas didn't want to go into his next surgery without knowing I was protected as his wife. He was very insistent." I looked at Silas. He was intubated, heavily sedated on a cocktail of fentanyl and midazolam. His eyes were half open, but they were vacant. He couldn't have consented to a sandwich, let alone a marriage. Lydia had brought in a crooked notary and a chaplain while he was drifting in a drug-induced fog to seize legal control of his life. She had already fired his longtime housekeeper and changed the security codes to his mansion. She thought she'd played the perfect game. She saw a helpless old man and a big payday. What she didn't see was the woman standing in front of her who knew how to turn a marriage into a financial execution. Lydia Cross didn't just want Silas's money, she wanted his legacy, and I was about to show her that my audits don't just find mistakes, they destroy lives. I didn't argue with Lydia in the hospital room. In my line of work, if you show your hand too early, the fox bolts for the woods. I played the part of the shocked, grieving friend. I let my shoulders slump. I let a few tears well up in my eyes, and I walked out of the ICU like a woman who had been defeated. Lydia watched me go with a look of pure, smug satisfaction. She thought she had neutralized me. She thought I was just another old lady who was too slow to keep up with her scheme. The moment I reached the hospital parking lot, the mask came off. I got into my car, opened my laptop, and plugged in my encrypted hotspot. I still have read-only access to several high-level financial databases through my former colleagues at the Bureau, and it was time to pull a deep audit on Mrs. Lydia Cross Vance. I started with the name she gave me. Lydia Cross was a ghost, but ghosts always leave footprints in the snow. I tracked her Social Security number through 3 different states. In Nevada, she was a caregiver for a wealthy rancher who died of natural causes just weeks after signing over her vehicles. In Arizona, she was a wellness consultant for a retired judge. But it was Florida where I found the glitch in her matrix, the mistake that would lead to her downfall. I found a joint bank account in a small credit union in Sarasota. The account was active, and it was being fed by monthly alimony payments from a man named Marcus Thorne. I pulled the marriage records for Sarasota County. Lydia and Marcus had been married 7 years ago. I searched every database for a divorce decree, a death certificate, or an annulment. Nothing. The record was a solid, unbroken line. Lydia was currently receiving $4,000 a month in alimony from her first husband while pretending to be the loving wife of Silas Vance. Lydia wasn't a wife. She was a bigamist. She was committing a felony every second she spent in Silas's room, and more importantly, she was committing wire fraud every time those alimony checks hit her account. But I knew the law could be slow. If I just called the local police, Lydia would have her bags packed and Silas's jewelry sold before they even processed the paperwork. A bigamy charge might get her a few months in jail, but it wouldn't get Silas's money back. I sat in my car for 3 hours building a map of her finances. She had already moved $50,000 from Silas's liquid accounts into a travel expense account she controlled. She was moving fast, which meant I had to move faster. I needed to create a situation where Lydia didn't just go to jail, but where she became legally and financially responsible for the very man she was trying to kill. I needed to move the debt to her. I opened a new spreadsheet and began drafting the global asset merger. This wouldn't be a court battle. It would be a mathematical execution. The deeper I dug into Lydia's digital footprint, the more I realized she wasn't just a petty thief. She was a predator who understood the gray areas of the law. She knew that hospitals and banks often defer to the person standing right in front of them, especially if that person has a notarized marriage certificate. By the 3rd day, she had already contacted Silas's primary wealth management firm, attempting to liquidate a $250,000 bond portfolio to cover his medical expenses. She was working against the clock, and I was the only one who could see the countdown. I spent the night in my home office, surrounded by the hum of my servers and the cold glow of 3 monitors. To stop Lydia, I couldn't just block her access. I had to bait her with something she couldn't resist. I began constructing a financial mirage. Using my knowledge of offshore tax law, I drafted a document that I titled the Global Asset Merger and Diversification Agreement. To an amateur, the title sounds like a high-level corporate document that moves wealth into tax-free havens. In reality, it was a specialized contract known as a third-party debt assumption. I created a shell company, a trust that existed only on paper. Then I pulled every unpaid bill related to Silas's care. Between the air ambulance, the neuro ICU stay, the specialized medications, and the private surgical consults, the debt was sitting at a staggering $1.2 million. Usually, an estate pays these bills over time, but my asset merger had a hidden poison pill. It stated that in order to unlock Silas's offshore holdings, which didn't actually exist, the signer had to personally guarantee and assume the active liabilities of the estate. The trick was in the language. I used archaic accounting terms like pro rata equity distribution and accrued liability offset. I made the document 40 pages long, knowing Lydia's greed would make her skip the middle sections. I made sure the first 5 pages spoke loudly about a $2.5 million legacy account held in the Cayman Islands. I knew that Lydia would see that number and her brain would shut off. She would see a payday that would allow her to disappear forever. I called Lydia from a burner phone. I made my voice sound tired, shaky, and defeated. I told her that as Silas's former accountant, I'd found a problem with his offshore trust. I told her that unless the current spouse signed a merger agreement to consolidate his assets, the $2.5 million would be seized by the IRS for unpaid corporate taxes. I could hear her breathing quicken over the phone. She was a shark that had just smelled a massive amount of blood in the water. She She agreed to meet me the next morning at a quiet cafe near the hospital. She told me to bring the clean version of the paperwork. She had no idea that she was walking into a financial slaughterhouse. I arrived at the cafe early. I chose a table in the back corner, away from the windows, where the lighting was dim and the atmosphere was hushed. I didn't want any distractions. I had my briefcase open, with the 40-page asset merger sitting right on top. Beside it, hidden in a side pocket, was the real folder, the one containing the bigamy evidence, the Florida marriage records, and the alimony wire transfer receipts. Lydia walked in 15 minutes late, intentionally trying to show her dominance. She was wearing a new expensive silk scarf and carrying a designer bag that I knew Silas's money had paid for. She sat down across from me and didn't even order coffee. She just stared at the folder. "Is the offshore account real, Aggie?" she asked, her voice dropping the nurse act entirely. She sounded like a corporate raider. I checked Silas's bank statements. I didn't see any transfers to the Caymans. "That's because it's a blind trust, Lydia," I lied, keeping my face perfectly still. "It was set up 30 years ago. It's not on his domestic statements. But the IRS has flagged the account because it hasn't been merged with his primary estate. If you don't sign this merger today, the government will freeze it tomorrow. I'm only telling you this because I want Silas's legacy to stay intact. I don't care who gets the money, as long as the government doesn't." I pushed the document toward her. I watched her eyes dart over the first few pages. She saw the $2.5 million figure. She saw the immediate access clause. She flipped through the boring, dense pages of accounting jargon, the pages where I had hidden the clause stating she was personally assuming $1.2 million in medical debt. She was moving too fast. Her greed was her blindfold. "I need a witness," she said, looking around. "I brought a mobile notary," I said, gesturing to a man sitting at the bar. He was actually a private investigator I had hired, but he held a valid notary commission. Lydia didn't care. She beckoned him over. She pulled out her Florida driver's license, the one that still said Lydia Cross. She signed the document with a flourish, her signature bold and confident. She thought she was signing her way into a life of luxury on a beach. The notary stamped the document and handed it back to me. I tucked it safely into my briefcase. I felt a surge of cold adrenaline. The trap was set, and the steel jaws had just snapped shut on her ankles. She didn't feel the pain yet, but she was already caught. "So when do I get the access codes?" she asked, leaning back and crossing her arms. "There are no codes, Lydia," I said, my voice suddenly turning ice cold, "because there is no offshore account, but there is a very real debt, and according to the contract you just signed, you are now personally responsible for every cent of Silas's $1.2 million medical bill. You didn't sign for his wealth, you signed for his bills." Lydia's face didn't change at first. She just stared at me, her brain trying to process the shift in my tone. Then she let out a short, harsh laugh. "What are you talking about? You said there was a trust. You showed me the numbers. You can't just lie on a legal document." "I didn't lie on the document, Lydia," I said, pulling the second folder from my briefcase. "The document says contingent on the existence of assets. If the assets don't exist, the merger fails, but the personal debt assumption clause in Section 14 is absolute. It's an independent covenant. You signed it as a private individual, but that's actually the least of your problems." I opened the second folder and slid the first page across the table. It was a high-resolution copy of her marriage license to Marcus Thorne in Sarasota, Florida. Beside it, I placed a printed log of her bank account showing the monthly alimony payments from Marcus, the most recent one having hit her account just 4 days ago. "You're a bigamist, Lydia," I said, my voice steady and unforgiving. "You married Silas while you were still legally married to Marcus in Sarasota. That makes your marriage to Silas void from the very beginning. You have no legal standing as his wife. You have no right to be in his hospital room, and you certainly have no right to his estate."
Lydia's eyes went wide. The silk scarf around her neck suddenly looked like a noose. She grabbed the Florida marriage license and tried to rip it, but I just pulled out another copy. I have dozens of these, Lydia, and so do the police. I've already sent a digital file to the Sarasota County Sheriff's Office and the local district attorney here. "You're crazy," she hissed, her voice trembling with rage. "If the marriage is void, then the contract I just signed is void too. You didn't get anything." "That's where you're wrong, Lydia," I replied, pulling the second folder from my briefcase. "The debt assumption contract is a civil contract. It doesn't require you to be a wife. It only requires you to be a person who signed a piece of paper in front of a notary. You signed that paper as Lydia Cross, your legal name. You didn't sign as a spouse. You signed as a guarantor. You've legally agreed to pay Silas's debts regardless of whether you're married to him or not." I saw the moment the reality hit her. It was like watching a building collapse in slow motion. The smugness vanished, replaced with a raw, naked terror. She looked at the door, her body tensing up as if she were about to bolt. "Don't bother running," I said. "I've already frozen the $50,000 you stole from Silas's travel account. I filed an emergency lis pendens on your personal assets this morning based on the fraud investigation. You have no money, you have no husband, and in about 3 minutes you're going to have no freedom." As if on cue, 2 plainclothes officers walked into the cafe. Lydia looked at them, then back at me. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. She had spent her life playing people, but she had finally met someone who played the numbers, and the numbers had just called her out. Lydia was sitting frozen as the officers approached. She tried one last desperate gamble. She grabbed the 40-page document off the table and tried to shove it into her mouth, attempting to chew and swallow the signature page. It was a pathetic, frantic move that showed just how far her Zen nurse persona had fallen. The officers moved in quickly, pinning her arms and prying the crumpled paper from her hand. "That won't help you, Lydia," I said, watching the scene with the detached calm of a woman who had seen much worse in audit rooms. "The notary used a digital timestamp and a hidden camera. We have a high-definition recording of you signing that document of your own free will. The physical paper is just a formality now." As they pulled her up from the chair and clicked the handcuffs into place, Lydia finally found her voice. It wasn't the sweet, melodic voice she used in the ICU. It was a guttural, ugly screech. "This is entrapment! You tricked me! You told me there was money! You can't hold me to a contract based on a lie!" "It wasn't a lie, Lydia," I said, standing up and smoothing my skirt. "I told you there was a special medical portfolio. There is. It's a portfolio of debt. I told you there were accrued liabilities. There are. You just chose to interpret those words as millions of dollars because you are blinded by your own greed. A judge isn't going to see entrapment. They're going to see a professional scammer who got out-negotiated by a retired accountant." I walked closer to her, so close she could smell the peppermint on my breath. "And here is the gotcha clause you missed on page 32. It's called a non-dischargeability covenant. It means that even if you declare bankruptcy, which you will, this debt cannot be erased. You will owe Silas's estate $1.2 million until the day you die. Every paycheck you earn in the prison laundry, every cent of a future inheritance you might get, every tax refund, it all belongs to Silas now." The officers began to lead her out. The cafe patrons were staring, some filming with their phones. Lydia was struggling, her expensive designer bag falling to the floor and spilling its contents, stolen jewelry, vials of Silas's medication, and several forged ID cards. "Wait," she yelled, looking back at me. "What about the bigamy? That's just a misdemeanor. I'll be out in 6 months." "Not quite," I replied. Since you've been receiving alimony from Florida while living in this state and marrying Silas, you've committed interstate wire fraud. That's a federal offense, and since you used Silas's social security number to attempt to liquidate his bonds, that's aggravated identity theft. You're not going to local jail, you're going to a federal facility, and I've already sent your Florida husband, Marcus, all the evidence of your secret wedding. I imagine he'll be filing a suit for the return of 7 years of alimony by tomorrow. I watched as they pushed her into the back of the squad car. She looked small and defeated through the glass. The bloodhound had found its mark, but the job wasn't over. I still had to go back to the hospital and undo the damage she had done to Silas's life.
With Lydia safely behind bars, the atmosphere in the ICU changed almost instantly. I presented the bigamy evidence and the police report to the hospital's legal department. Within an hour, her medical proxy was revoked, and I was reinstated as Silas's primary decision-maker. I hired a new team of nurses, women I had personally vetted through 3 different background checks. I made sure they knew that if a single person tried to visit Silas without my written permission, they were to call the police immediately. I sat by Silas's bed that evening. The hum of the monitors, which had felt like a funeral march just days ago, now felt like a steady, rhythmic promise of life. He was still sedated, but the doctors were starting to wean him off the heavy meds Lydia had insisted on. As the fog cleared, I saw the first spark of the real Silas Vance return to his eyes. "Aggie," he whispered, his voice raspy and thin. "I'm here, Silas," I said, taking his hand. This time, the grip was real. Where is the nurse, the one who said we were married?" I didn't sugarcoat it. Silas was a man who built skyscrapers. He could handle the truth. I told him everything. I told him about the ICU wedding, the bigamy, the attempted theft of his $5 million estate, and the debt trap I had used to stop her. He listened in silence, his eyes welling with tears of shock, and then, slowly, a flicker of his old, sharp anger. "She thought I was an easy mark," he croaked, a small, tired smile touching his lips. "She thought you were a bank, Silas. She didn't realize you were a man with a very protective accountant." Over the next few weeks, Silas's recovery was nothing short of a miracle. Free from the over-sedation Lydia had been using to keep him compliant, his speech returned, and he began intensive physical therapy. But while his body was healing, I was busy with the final audit of justice. Lydia's lawyer boyfriend, the man who had posed as a chaplain, had been picked up by the FBI attempting to flee to Mexico. He had turned on her instantly, trading a confession for a lighter sentence. He confirmed that Lydia had targeted Silas months ago, tracking his health and his wealth from a distance. They had planned this for a long time, but they hadn't planned for me. I spent my days in Silas's library, going through every single account Lydia had touched. I found she had already moved $200,000 into a dark account. I didn't just freeze it. I used the debt assumption contract she'd signed to legally claim that money as an advance payment on Silas's medical bills. By the time I was done, Lydia Cross didn't just have no money. She had a negative net worth that would take 3 lifetimes to pay back. I was making sure that when she finally stepped out of her prison cell, she would be stepping into a world where she owned nothing but the clothes on her back. The criminal trial for Lydia Cross was a foregone conclusion. Between the bigamy, the wire fraud, and the testimony from her accomplice, she didn't have a leg to stand on. But for a forensic accountant, a criminal sentence is only half the battle. True justice is found in the civil liquidation. I wanted to make sure that Lydia was not only imprisoned, but financially erased. I filed a massive civil suit on behalf of Silas's estate. We sued for fraudulent inducement, conversion, and intentional infliction of emotional distress, but the anchor of the suit was the global asset merger contract.
I stood in the courtroom and explained to the judge that while the merger was based on a lack of assets, the debt assumption clause was a voluntary agreement signed by an adult who had every opportunity to read the fine print. Lydia's new public defender tried to argue that the contract was unconscionable. He argued that no sane person would agree to take on $1.2 million in debt for no reason. She didn't sign it for no reason, I testified, looking directly at Lydia, who was sitting in her orange jumpsuit, looking haggard and old. She signed it because she was so blinded by her own greed that she believed she was getting a $2.5 million offshore trust. She wasn't a victim of a bad contract. She was a victim of her own criminal intent. She signed a gamble, and she lost. The judge agreed. He upheld the contract. This was a massive win because it meant that even the money Lydia had hidden away before she met Silas, money she had stolen from other elderly victims, could now be seized to satisfy the debt she owed to Silas. I tracked down 3 other victims, a retired teacher in Arizona, a widower in Nevada, and the family of a rancher who had passed away under suspicious circumstances. Using the money we seized from Lydia's private accounts, I didn't just pay Silas's bills. I worked with the FBI to distribute the remaining funds back to the families Lydia had robbed years ago. Watching those families receive their checks was better than any audit I had ever completed for the government. I was using the thief's own greed to fund the restitution of her victims. Lydia had spent years ghosting through the system, leaving a trail of broken lives and empty bank accounts. I had turned the system into a vacuum that was now sucking every bit of wealth she had ever touched back to its rightful owners. She was left with nothing but a public defender and a long list of enemies. The ghost hunter did more than catch the ghost. I made sure they stayed buried under a mountain of their own paperwork. Silas Vance was finally discharged from the hospital 3 months after the wedding. He didn't go to a hospice and he didn't go to a state-run facility. He went home to his mansion, which I had personally supervised the restoration of. The locks had been changed, a new security team was in place, and the gardens were blooming again. On his first night back, we sat in his library, the same place where his stroke had occurred. He was in a wheelchair, but his mind was as sharp as the skyscrapers he used to design. He had a glass of sparkling cider in his hand, and I had my final restitution report in mine. "Tell me the final numbers, Aggie," he said, his voice stronger than I'd heard in months. "I want to know the score." "The score is 0 for her, Silas," I said, opening the folder. "Lydia was sentenced this morning to 15 years in federal prison. Because of the aggravated nature of the elder abuse, the judge gave her the maximum. Her accomplice got 8. But here's the part you'll like." I showed him the spreadsheet. "We recovered the $200,000 she stole from you. We seized her personal accounts in Florida, totaling $450,000. After paying off your medical bills and the legal fees, your estate is actually up by $50,000, which I've donated in your name to the National Elder Fraud Foundation. And the debt assumption contract, it stays on her record forever. If she ever wins the lottery in prison, or if she tries to write a book about her crimes, the money goes straight to your medical trust. She's effectively your financial servant for the rest of her life." Silas laughed, a deep, hearty sound that filled the room. "You really are a bloodhound, Aggie. You didn't just bite her, you swallowed her whole." "I just did the math, Silas. She provided the variables. I just provided the solution." But there was one final glitch I hadn't told him about yet. I'd found out through my contacts that Marcus, the Florida husband, had been so grateful for the evidence I provided that he had dropped his own lawsuit against Lydia and instead donated his recovered alimony to the same fraud foundation. The world was righting itself 1 decimal point at a time. As I left Silas's house that night, I looked back at the grand stone structure. It was a fortress again. I drove home in the quiet of the night, feeling the weight of the last few months lift off my shoulders. I'd spent my career chasing paper trails that led to cold, empty rooms. This time, the trail led to a friend's life. I went into my garden, pulled a few weeds, and looked at the moon. The ghost hunter was officially back in retirement. But as I tucked my laptop away, I knew that if another glitch ever appeared in my neighborhood, I'd be ready. 1 year has passed since Lydia Cross was led away in handcuffs. I've recently received a letter from the federal prison where she's serving her time. It was a rambling, angry mess of a letter filled with threats and accusations. She claimed I had stolen her life and that she would find a way to sue me the moment she got out. I didn't throw the letter away. I filed it in a folder labeled Ongoing Liability. You see, Lydia still doesn't understand the world she's in. She thinks she's a victim of a mean lady with a calculator. She doesn't realize she's a victim of the very system she tried to exploit. Every month, I receive a compliance report from the court-appointed receiver. It shows the tiny amounts of money being garnished from Lydia's prison commissary account, money she earns from scrubbing floors and sewing uniforms. It's usually about $12.50 a month. It's a drop in the bucket of a $1.2 million debt. But that's not the point. The point is the audit. The audit never ends. As long as that debt exists, Lydia Cross is legally tethered to the truth. She cannot hide, she cannot scam, and she cannot build a new life of lies. She's legally bound to the man she tried to destroy. Every time she sees that deduction on her statement, she's reminded that Agatha Sterling is still watching the ledgers. Silas is doing well. He's walking with a cane now, and he's even started consulting on a new architectural project, a community center for seniors. We have dinner once a week, and we never talk about Lydia anymore. We talk about the future. We talk about